Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about option generators and generic API requests. Let's go ahead and get started. And as always, thank you for watching. Throughout this course, we're going to take a look specifically at how option generators are able to enhance the form that we have created in our Rewst 102 course. From there, we'll also take a look at generic API requests and how we're able to use this tool within Rewst to call the Microsoft Graph API. And as we do, we'll also take a look at list comprehension and really implement what we learned in Rewst 103 here in Rewst 104. In this course, what we're going to be doing is filtering out the list of groups based on whether a user is a member or not a member of a group. When we are adding the user to a group, we're only going to be displaying the groups that the user is a member of. And when we are removing a user from a group, we'll only be displaying the groups that the user is a member of. To achieve this functionality, we're going to be using an option generator. So to provide a quick definition, an option generator is a special type of workflow that allows us to curate the options that are displayed on a form field. So in this situation, we'll be using the option generator to show groups based off of what we just discussed. Let's go ahead and dive into the platform and see the option generator and generic API in action. I'm back over here at the form that we worked on in Rewst 102. And what we'll be doing is switching the group field and the add or remove field. By switching these two fields, when the form filler selects the user and selects the add or remove radio button, we'll be passing those values to our special workflow called the option generator. Once we've made this change, let's go ahead and save the file. Clicking submit, and we've saved our form. Let's go ahead and create our option generator. We'll head over to the left-hand side under automation, and then we're going to select workflows. I'll open up workflows as a new tab. And then once we're in the workflow section, I'll head over to create. We'll give our option generator a name. I'll start off with demo, followed by option generator for groups based on user membership. Once we have a name, we'll go ahead and click submit. Now that we've created this workflow, we need to specify the workflow as an option generator, and we also have to let the workflow know of the two inputs that we're going to be selecting in our form. To configure those things, we're going to head up and click on the pencil icon. Under the general section, you'll see workflow type. We'll click on the dropdown and select option generator. As always, make sure to add a time saved. I like to put 5 minutes as a default. And last thing we'll do here is configure the inputs. We'll create two inputs. The first input will be the user ID. We'll say that is required for this workflow to work. And then the second one will be the action, whether we are adding or removing a user. We'll also check required. Now down here on output configuration, when we are configuring a option generator, there will always be a preset output configuration that we need to specify. So we'll click on add output, and that preset or pre-named variable is going to be called options. The value of options we will come back to as we are building out our workflow. So keep in mind, we'll be back here to fill out the value shortly. Let's go ahead and click submit. Now that we've set the workflow as a option generator, and we've also specified the two variables that we're going to be expecting from the form, let's start building out our workflow. Again, what we're trying to do is show groups based off of whether we are adding or removing a user from a group. Let's start with removing a user from a group. When we are going through that functionality, what we want to do is show a list of groups that the user is a member of. The first thing I'm going to do is add a noop to our workflow editor. We'll add that by right-clicking and then selecting it from my favorite actions. This noop will function just like the noop we built in Rewst 102. I'll first start off by renaming the noop add or remove. And we're going to have two transitions, one for add and the other for remove. So we'll create a new transition and we'll start over here with remove. Creating the custom condition, we're going to be checking the action variable to see if it is equal to the value remove. So we saw how to do that in Rewst 102. Context variable is called action, seeing is that equal to the value remove. Close it out once you're all set. And if you look through the graph section, you'll fail to find the action to show a list of groups that the user is a member of. You can use the search bar, you can look through, but at the recording of this video, that action doesn't exist. If we spent a little bit of time Googling for a Microsoft Graph API that shows a user's group membership, we'll find that there is a specific API call that we can use to get exactly what we're looking for, a list of groups that the user is a member of. It currently doesn't exist within Rewst as an action, at least at the recording of this video. But what we provide is what's called a generic API request. In the platform, it is called an API request. And each one of the integrations that we have has this feature. So if there is a specific action that you're looking to use and we don't have it out of the box with Rewst, you can use this API request action to call the API of the integration that you are looking to perform an action for. So in our situation, we're looking for the graph API request, and then I'll go ahead and add it below our noop. What we'll need to do is add the endpoint as a parameter within the API request. I found the specific documentation and the specific endpoint for the action of getting that list of groups that I'm a member of. We'll be using this second URL because we can see that there is a parameter that we can pass in the URL. In our situation, we can pass the user ID. I'll go ahead and copy this URL and we'll head back over to our Graph API request and then input it as an endpoint here. I'll then go into my Jinja editor and we'll replace this portion of the URL with our context variable user underscore ID. Once we have that all filled out, I'll go ahead and close this out. I'll connect the remove to my generic API request that is calling the endpoint to get us that list of groups that this user is a member of. I'll rename this list user groups. And just like that, we have implemented a generic graph API request that will get us a list of groups that this user is a member of. Now that we have a specific output, we can configure that options variable output that we set a little bit ago. Before we do, we will create a data alias here for the list user groups. I'll click on the transition and then we'll create a new data alias. We'll call this variable group underscore list. And then the value of this variable will be the result of the action that this transition is connected to. We're going to use a very specific pattern to do this. So jumping into our Jinja editor, 2 curly brackets followed by a spacebar, and the pattern to get the results of the action that the transition is connected to is like so: result data.value. Once you have that typed out, go ahead and close it out. So now we have a variable called group list that's going to contain all of the groups that the user is a member of. Let's head into our workflow variables configuration. And then we can scroll down, and in our output configuration, we'll click on the Jinja editor. And then our variable will be that group list that we just created. We'll then go ahead and close this out and then click submit. So we've implemented a generic API for graph. We've added the value to our option generator. The next thing we need to do is implement the left-hand side. One thing to note, because we are either adding or removing, we're only going to take one path in our option generator. So what we'll end up doing is reusing the name group list, since it'll only have one value, either a list of groups that I am a member of or not a member of. Let's go ahead and implement the add side. Clicking on the onSuccess transition, I'll give this the label of add. We'll implement the custom condition going into our Jinja editor. We're going to be checking the action variable to see if it is equal to the value add. Once we do, we'll go ahead and close this out. So what we need now is a list of groups that the user is not a member of. If you look through documentation, we aren't going to find an easy API to implement. We have to implement some sort of logic to create this new list. So first things first, whenever we think about creating a new list, what should come to mind is list comprehension. So we know we're going to be using list comprehension to create this new list, but what's the logic going to be? So to highlight this, I'm going to head over to the Jinja Live Editor and do a little bit of pseudo-coding. So as mentioned, we're going to be creating a new list. So we know that when creating a new list, we can use list comprehension like so. This part is, again, going to be pseudocode. This isn't going to be fully functioning code. So when explaining list comprehension, I like to highlight 3 parts that we need in list comprehension. We need an output, the construction of our new list. So which existing lists are we using to construct our new one? And then which conditions are we setting to pick and choose which items from our construction phase are going to be added as an output. So these are the 3 things that we're going to be needing. Let's talk through what we have. So digging through our Rewst actions, we're going to have an action that gives us all of the groups. So I'll have a list of all groups. And we already implemented the generic API to give us a list of groups that I am a member of. I'll call that one the users groups, or just simply user groups. These are the 2 lists that we're going to have. So we can specify these as context variables. So we'll have a ctx.allGroups and then a ctx.userGroups. And we'll specify those within the data aliases of each one of these actions. So we're going to be going through each one of the items of our all groups. So to do that, we're going to use a for loop, and then we're going to need to give a name to our pointer. We can keep it simple and call it group. And that's going to be for each one of these items. From here in the condition, as pseudocode, what we want to do is see if group, the item that we are pointing at in all groups, is not in the user groups. And then as for the output, we're just going to be outputting each group that meets this condition that we set in line 3. We might need to do a little bit more here, but as a baseline, this is effectively what we're doing. Go through each item of our all groups list and see if that item does not exist in the users group. If it does not exist, we will be adding it to our newly created list so that we can output a list of groups that this user is not a member of. So let's jump back to our main workflow and implement some of these things. We're going to need a list of all the groups, and then we're going to make a copy of our generic API to get us a list of the groups that the user is a member of. So heading back over to the workflow, in the search, we're going to search under the graph section for listing the groups. So we'll bring out the list groups. We'll connect the add transition to the graph action of listing all of our groups. I'll rename this just to make it easier to reference it throughout. I'll call this list all groups. Just as we did with the generic API, when we go into the transition of an action, we can create a variable and store the results of the action within the variable. So just like what we did over here, we're looking for a list of all groups. So what I'll do is just match it. For the key, we'll call the variable all groups. And then the value of this is just going to be the result of the action. And we saw how to get that using the pattern result data.value, like so. Once we have that, let's close it out. And then next, we're going to need a list of groups that the user is a member of. So we can go ahead and create a copy of the generic API that we implemented. I'll connect the transition to the action. And then in the transition of our list user groups, we're going to change this data alias to match what I pseudocode over here. So user underscore groups. So I'll call this user underscore groups. And then the value is the same, result data.value. And then last thing we're going to do is implement the logic to have the difference between these two lists. So implementing the pseudocode over in our Jinja Live Editor. To do that, I'm going to be putting that in a noop. So adding a noop to the page, connecting our user groups transition to the noop. I'll rename the noop something more descriptive. I'll call it build group list. And then in the transition is where we're going to be implementing our Jinja. So I'm going to create a new data alias. This is going to be the output of this variable will be the output of our option generator. So I'll be reusing the variable name that we specified over in the workflow variables. Since an option generator can only have one output configuration called options, we're going to be reusing this group list variable because our workflow will only follow one of these paths. So it'll either be this value on the right or this value on the left. So there's no issues with any conflicting data. So data alias, we're going to be calling it group underscore list. We're going to jump into our Jinja editor and implement the effectively the code that we just saw. So 2 curly brackets in the spacebar will autocomplete. I'll hit enter and clean up some of these spaces here. We'll tab and then use the square bracket for our list comprehension. So now we can actually just implement the code. So the construction part, I like to start first, right? We are going to be building off of the list of all of the groups that we have. We'll name the pointer group like we did in the pseudocode is ctx.allgroups. From here, we're going to be checking our group in the all groups against the user groups. When implementing this in practice, what we found was that we are comparing the group object to another group object. And sometimes they are not consistent. And so just comparing the object to another object gives us some errors. So what we'll need to do is compare something that is always going to be the same. And the thing that we can compare that will always be the same will be the user IDs. So what we're going to be doing is checking the user ID of the groups in the all groups list against the groups in the user groups list. And let's see how to do that. So this is the third line. This is our condition. And when our pointer group is pointing at an item in the list, in this case, a group object, we can access its attributes. In this case, we're going to be accessing the ID attribute. And we're going to check to see if that ID attribute is not in the list called user groups. So not in, but because right now we only have a list of groups for the user groups, we'll need to use another list comprehension to get a pointer to point at a group object to access the ID in the user groups list. Let's see what that looks like. So another list comprehension. We'll start with the construction part first. I'll call the pointer user group. And the list that we're going to be building off of will be the list of groups that the user is a member of. Now that we have our pointer, we can access the attributes of the group object that the pointer will be pointing at. In this case, we want to access the ID, like so. And the last thing up here is the output. And what we want to output is a list of groups that the user is not a member of. So in this case, just the pointer, no need to access any of the attributes. And let's walk through this code one more time. We'll start from line 4, and we have a pointer called group that will point at each group in our list called all groups. So every group. The next line here is line 5, and this is our condition. We want to compare IDs because the ID will always be something that is consistent, whereas group objects can differ between one or another. So we won't be comparing the same thing. So as the group pointer points at each item of the all groups list, we're going to be accessing the ID. From there, we want to compare IDs between the all groups list and the user groups list. So we're going to be implementing the same logic in another list comprehension so that we can pull out the ID of the group within the user groups. So we implemented another list comprehension. We have the pointer user group pointing at each item in our user groups list. And as we do, we access the ID of the user group. We'll then compare the group ID with the user underscore group ID. And if group ID is not in the user underscore groups ID, then we will add it to our new list, thus creating a list of groups that I am not a member of. Let's go ahead and close this out. And the last thing we're going to be doing before testing this out is adding a trigger and then tying this workflow to the groups field in the form. So first thing, let's go ahead and add a trigger, clicking on the add trigger up at the top. We'll give this trigger a name. I'll call it OG trigger for option generator trigger. I'll toggle enabled. And then for trigger type, clicking on the dropdown, there isn't anything that we are waiting for or any action that we're going to need to perform before this workflow goes. So under the core section, there is a trigger type called always pass. So once the required inputs are given to our workflow, it's just going to execute. Let's go ahead and scroll down towards the bottom. We'll click submit. And then last thing I'm going to do is click publish, followed by submit. Now that we have this part squared away, let's head back over to the form and connect the option generator to the group field. Back over at the form, I'm going to refresh the page so that it'll pick up the changes that we've made, so that it'll pick up the workflow that we just created. We're going to click into the group field, and then we'll scroll down and select workflow generated. We'll then select the workflow that we just created, the option generator. We'll scroll down a little further, and we're going to change the label field to display name. So the label field is just how do you want to display the options that the option generator will be showing in the field. And we want to use the display name attribute of our groups which will just be the name of the group. Scrolling down a little bit further, with every workflow, we're going to need to start it. And here we're going to be specifying how does the workflow start or how is it triggered. We're just going to be using the trigger inside of the workflow. And then we specified that there are two inputs that this option generator, the special workflow, is going to need. It's going to need the action and the user ID. We can get those two variables from the form. So let's go ahead and check the box for each one and select the variable from the form. Starting with the action, I'll select the action variable. And then for the user ID, we'll pull that from the form as well, selecting user ID. We'll go ahead and save, and then we'll click submit. The last thing we're going to do is check out the form to see our option generator in action. I'll head back to the workflow from Rewst 102. We'll click on the gear and access the form using the view direct URLs. Selecting the URL to send us over to the form, I'll select the user. We'll say Cluck Norris. I'll select remove, and this will test out the generic API connected with the remove action. And we'll see there is a list of groups here, and it's not as extensive as what we would see if it was everything. I'll go ahead and select add. And clicking on the drop down, same thing, not as extensive as the complete list. And then if we took a little bit of time to compare them, we would see that these lists are indeed different. We see, for example, all users is under the remove section, but if I click on add and search for all, it doesn't show up, even with a capital all. So as a brief recap, option generators are a way for us to curate the options that are displayed in a field. And in our example, we are curating the groups that show up in this group field. And generic APIs allows us to call APIs from the integrations that we have connected with Rewst when Rewst does not provide an action out of the box in the action menu. I want to thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.